Thanks very much, Ethan, and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, in my contribution, I'm going to change slightly the topic, but I think it fits in quite well with what Paul and John have actually explained so far or covered so far. So I'm going to look at one of the key issues that, in my view, underpins the current debate on levelling up. And that is the question of who should lead and how power should be distributed across different levels of governance to deliver the systemic change that is needed to rebalance our economy and ensure all people and places can prosper, which allegedly is the aim of the levelling up agenda. And in doing this, I'm going to focus mainly on the case of England, on the one hand, because that's where the main focus of my research, but I think that the case of England is particularly interesting because, of course, this is the only part of the country with a patchwork system of devolution, where subnational governance remains very centralized. But of course, similar issues exist also in the other nations of the UK, and perhaps that's something that we could discuss in the Q&A session later on. So to address this, I'll start by outlining some of the structural issues and systemic weaknesses that characterize governance relations and dynamics in England. And I will then try to cover three key questions or topics. The first concerns center-local relations and how the power and resources balance that underpins them has shifted over time in England. And then I'll look at the devolution agenda with a view to understand its strengths and weaknesses. And I'll conclude by looking at the current scenario and try to point out some of the reforms that would be needed if levelling up is going to actually happen. And in doing this, I'll draw on some of my recent research that I've conducted with colleagues at the Local Governance Research Centre for Unlocked Democracy. For example, we published recently a report that looks at the decline of local democracy across England during the past 40 years. Also, the results of the final reports of the APSI Local Government Commission 2030, and some of the work that I conducted when I was director at IPPR North, as well as a recent publication in the Political Quarterly on Metro Mayors. So starting with the systemic weaknesses of our governance model. Well, the first point to note here, in my view, is that England is certainly, as Paul emphasized at the beginning, one of the most centralized countries in the developed world. And this has a number of consequences. According to the Local Autonomy Index produced by the European Commission, our country ranks 31st out of 39. And those countries behind ours are actually countries with a much more problematic process of democratization. And so over-centralization is a structural issue that affect in a negative way both the functioning of our governance system, but also the economy. And the concentration of power at the center is, of course, a key feature of the British political tradition. But recent events like the COVID pandemic have laid bare the institutional failings of our governance system and have clearly exposed the dangers of leaving local insights out of the key policy decisions and resorting instead to a top-down command and control sort of approach. Over-centralization also means that in practice there is a tendency to develop place-blind, one-size-fits-all policy, while at the same time investment continues to be concentrated in specific parts of the country, especially in the south. And so this has a direct impact on the economy, as reflected in the widening of regional divides within England. And the levelling up agenda seeks to tap precisely into this issue with a view to rebalance the economy and empower localities. But on this last point, on the idea of empowering localities, what has happened in practice and how has the power and resources balance between central and local government changed over time? So the research that we have conducted for Unlocked Democracy and APSI clearly shows that this balance has increasingly tilted towards the center. There was, of course, already the relationship has always been kind of biased toward the center, but over time, the situation has actually gone worse. So until the late 1970s, councils had, for example, jurisdictional integrity, a high level of autonomy on key services and finances, and democratic legitimacy. But the lack of constitutional protection for local government has allowed a substantial shift over time. If we look at the past decades, local government reform has been a persistent feature, and central government has deployed a wide range of tools of central control that have substantially weakened the local level. So central-local relations, for example, have been increasingly juridified, but change has also come through the back door in a way, more in disguise, for example, through secondary legislation. While at the same time, contractualization and conditional localism have become the norm. Turning off the financial taps has also weakened further local autonomy. Local government funding has become increasingly ring-fenced and based on competitive bids. And in recent years, there have been attempts at reversing this trend, with councils, for example, being able to raise and retain more income locally. And yet, this has coincided with severe financial constraints and certainly centrally prescribed targets, exacerbating in practice a postcode lottery over service delivery. The COVID-19 crisis has now put additional strain on this already fragile system of funding, and many local authorities were already on the brink of collapse after 10 years of austerity, and the lack of adequate support from the center is now forcing them to cut essential services in crucial areas like adult social care and support for the most vulnerable. As a result, as emphasized by the National Audit Office in a report published earlier this year, many councils may not be able to actually survive the perfect storm generated by the COVID crisis. And most importantly, the National Audit Office has also underlined that the system of local government is in such a dire state that it cannot be fixed anymore with short-term interventions like the ones that we have seen over the past decades, and requires to be stabilized in the long term by means of structural and profound reform. So in sum, that emerges, what emerges is clearly quite a daunting picture. And that shows that over the past decades, we have actually walked backwards into increasing centralization of our practices of politics, policymaking, and democracy. Now, allegedly, and on to my second point, the devolution agenda in England was devised to address this and reverse this trend of recentralization. In practice, however, its top-down, bespoke, contractual, and competitive nature means that devolution remains a disconnected project that benefits only some areas but excludes many others, creating, in essence, winners and losers. So has devolution made a difference in practice since its inception? I think there is no straight kind of yes or no answer to this question, and perhaps it has. My view is that it has changed something, but at the same time there are still some structural issues that continue to persist. So surely, in some areas, devolution deals and the introduction, for example, of new institutions like metro mayors who lead combined authorities have brought in benefits. If we look at two areas as an example, for example, Greater Manchester and the Tees Valley, despite the limits to their formal powers and resources, during their first mandate, Andy Burnham and Ben Houchen have exercised agency and exerted powers, sometimes, and that's a very interesting point, going even beyond their mayoral remit, drawing on linkages upwards, especially with central government, in the case of Ben Houchen in particular, and across levels as well. So within their combined authorities, making use, for example, of a strong legacy of cross-council cooperation, like in the case of Greater Manchester, and building strong ties with local stakeholders. And they've also been developing distinctive style of local place-based leadership that makes this new figure very different from what we see at the national level. So what have they done in practice? In Greater Manchester, for example, Burnham delivered on a range of policy areas. He introduced free bus travel for young people. He has been very active in tackling homelessness and promoting the creation of good and fair jobs, while also seeking to re-regulate the bus network. In the Tees Valley, Houchen has saved the Teesside Airport from closure, taking it under public ownership, while also securing green jobs and a free port, and of course a new Treasury North campus in Darlington. So this may seem, if we compare them with the ambitions of a national government, this may seem like small things. And yet these are the type of policies that can make a difference on people in their day-to-day life. So fighting, for example, a mayoral election on the issue of buses is something that may seem unambitious, but in fact is perhaps something that gives us a sense of how these new local leaders actually are very able to reflect what are the needs of the local population. So surely each of these mayors, both Burnham and Auchen, have had at their disposal very different opportunity structures. As a conservative mayor, for example, in a former red wall area, Auchen had a direct access, had and still has direct access to central government, and could link his work to the success of the levelling up agenda. So of course, he was in a bit of an easier position. Burnham has incrementally developed a more confrontational relationship with central government, as epitomized by the standoff with the Prime Minister over the allocation of COVID support packages last year. But this process of othering against the centre has paid off in Greater Manchester at the local level, because it has allowed Burnham to develop an image of a leader that actually stands up to government in the interest of Greater Manchester and its community. So either way, the success of both mayors relates to their ability to harness the power of place, acting as institution that can help articulate local interest, but also identity, belonging, and civic pride. And so in this way, they have started to usher in a new form of localism, one could argue, tackling the limits of devolution that were implicit in its original design and generating buy-in from local communities, as shown, for example, by the higher levels of turnout and support at the May 2021 elections, and re-energizing local democracy. So in this sense, especially on the democratic aspect and on the element of buy-in from local communities, there has been something, a kind of something of a positive development. But of course, devolution is not, of course, they've not been able to resolve all of the pre-existing issues, but they've started to make a difference on the ground. And yet there are still some substantial issues that need to be tackled if we go back to the broader devolution agenda. First of all, not all areas are Greater Manchester or the Tees Valley. So not all areas have the long history of cross-council cooperation that is part and parcel of Greater Manchester's success. And not all places have access to the government, the kind of access to the government that the Tees Valleys could rely on. And to date, beyond London, only 10 devolution deals and 9 metro mayors are in place in England, leaving the vast majority of councils across England without any access to devolution. And so in this way, generating new divides between devolution deals haves and have-nots. And back to the issue of centre-local relations, the emergence of strong mayors seem to be bringing in benefit at the local level, but it could create also new frictions with the centre. It is possible that central government will be less inclined to relinquish further power and resources to challenger mayors with growing mandates. Mayors who have acted as facilitators, like Auchen, of the government agenda might be in an easier position for now, but that doesn't mean that this is a stable settlement. Indeed, the government, if we look at most recent development, the government has gone quite cold on the devolution agenda in recent months. And we now know that the long-awaited English devolution white paper has been called off, and any new devolution provision will arguably be subsumed into the levelling up white paper that should be published shortly. In addition, recent announcements on local funds like the town funds and the levelling up funds are tightly controlled by the centre. And the way in which the government has managed the COVID-19 crisis indicates that there is very little appetite to let go of power from Whitehall. Now, there has been some talk about new county devolution deals that might be on the cards, but the risk, again, is that this could turn into an initiative that is focused on electoral priorities rather than aiming to extend the reach of devolution beyond metropolitan areas, and that these county deals might also provide an excuse to deliver local government reform once again, through the back door in the direction of imposing unitaries in all parts of the country. Meanwhile, the twin shocks of Brexit and the COVID-19 crisis are widening further regional inequalities, while also exacerbating the financial viability of councils across the country. And this suggests that despite the local success of devolution in some areas, the structural and systemic weaknesses that underpin central-local relation in England are still standing, and over-centralization is still having a negative impact. And that's why, in my view, levelling up the country is far from an easy task. While so far the government has focused on investment in infrastructure and new pots of funding as a way to show its commitment to this agenda, it is becoming increasingly clear that levelling up cannot be delivered by the centre alone, from the top down, through one-off investment splashes. And so levelling up allegedly aims at rebalancing the economy, addressing existing inequality, and helping all places to prosper. But so-called left behind places are not all the same. They have different socioeconomic fabrics and outlooks, and this suggests that tackling their problems requires a place-based approach tailored around the specific needs of each area, and not just the electoral needs of the government. But that requires opening up to the local leaders, because local leaders, of course, are operating at a level that is closer to local communities and are able to grasp those differences that characterize different areas across the country. And there is also a need, of course, to give them the powers to drive rather than being at the receiving end of the levelling up agenda. And that's why, in my view, delivering real levelling up requires perhaps a moment of pause, looking back and fixing first our system of subnational governance, addressing the imbalances in central-local relations that have made the situation very difficult to manage and that have pushed council on the brink of collapse, reforming and rethinking the role of the centre and not just that of the local level. Then there is also a need to turn devolution into an open and flexible and inclusive process that is accessible to all areas and not just a selected few, with a clear framework and a clear direction of travel. And there is also perhaps a need, if this was to happen, to think about how local leaders should be involved in the design of policies and agendas that will affect the future of their areas. And of course, the Levelling Up white paper offers a very good opportunity in this sense, although so far it wouldn't seem that the government is particularly open to this kind of prospect. But involving leaders in a sort of a co-production of important strategies like the Levelling Up one, ensuring that they can have a direct input into it, would probably be a much needed change. This is, of course, I'm well aware that what I'm proposing here is quite a big challenge, and perhaps it's unsurprising that so far, while aware of these issues, neither the current government or the opposition have actually managed to propose a way that allows to make sure that levelling up is not just something that fixes small issues in the shorter term, but actually delivers structural change that can benefit, that can make the agenda benefit all people and places in the long term. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you.